Jean-Jacques Rousseau's work on education is Emile. And this is a semi-fictitious work, a story about a young boy being educated by Rousseau. Now, in terms of where he decides to raise Emile, he decides to do so in the country because he thinks that is a more natural environment for human beings, and this, not surprisingly, extends from his views expressed in earlier works. And he regards cities as both physically and mentally corrupting. Now, this notion that the country or rural areas are virtuous and cities are corrupting and evil is a commonly held one, especially in the United States, even though, as a matter of fact, we have large amounts of our population living in cities, and it's still, a common notion. There are various morality tales, stories, movies, TV shows, music videos, and actual real occurrences where somebody goes from a good and virtuous small town, they go off to the city, and they become, corrupted. If the story has a tragic ending, the person, typically falls into criminal activity or becomes otherwise, corrupted in some terrible manner. And in the most tragic of tales, they end up falling deeply and then dying terribly. Now, it also is a fixture in American politics in terms of presenting the cities as corrupt and terrible and the rural areas as being the real America. And all sorts of virtuous attributes are assigned to rural areas and small towns, and all sorts of, sins and terribleness assigned to cities. But like most things in politics, all of this is a myth, stereotyping and overgeneralization, because if you look at the actual statistics, it's not borne out that rural areas are always better than city areas. It's a myth. It's a political myth. Now, to the degree to which Jean-Jacques Rousseau influenced this, it's an interesting question. But the idea of the corrupting city and the good natural world is one that's definitely developed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it is one that still runs through many views, especially in the United States. But continuing along with moral education. So Rousseau claims that education is learning how to live, and the right way to do this is to follow a guardian who knows the proper path to the good life. And he splits the moral education into 3 stages. And this distinguishes him a bit from Aristotle. Our good dad friend Aristotle does talk about moral education in the youth, basically get people while they're young, educate them. And Rousseau takes it up to about 15 and the start of adulthood, whereas Aristotle believes that moral education must persist throughout of all life to avoid backsliding. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau breaks it down into the following stages. The first one is from the beginning until about 10 or 12. And he believes that at this point, children are basically like animals, according to him, and they are incapable of complex thought. And again, Rousseau, probably not an expert on child psychology and child development, but that's his view. Kids are basically animals until about that age. The second one begins where the first one leads off, 10 or 12, depending on the individual child, and lasts until 15, which he takes to be the start of reason. Then the final one begins at 15, and then is the start of adulthood. And then presumably, it's over as an adult. So his view is, since he holds or contends that people are basically naturally good, or at least not naturally corrupt, and so moral education is more about following social instincts. So what else must be done? Why can't kids just be left to follow their instincts and develop? Well, the guardian must protect the children or child from the corrupting influences of the city. And the city's corruption includes individualism and self-consciousness. And so Rousseau believes that, again, moral education should take place when people are young and should take place out in the natural world. Now, not surprisingly, his theology of nature was condemned because he presents the this fellow, this Savoyard vicar in Emile, and the Calvinists and Catholics, although Calvinists are Protestants, they did definitely agree on wanting to condemn Emile, specifically, of course, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the author. So we have these 3 sections of growth, and it led to, these charges of condemnation. So education for him comes from 3 sources: nature, other people, and the third is circumstances. And so the internal development of our faculties and organs, basically our natural growth, is, not surprisingly, education nature has given us. One might be inclined to say that's not really like education as such. We're just, developing physiologically. Now, science or current research shows that obviously as people get older, our faculties generally improve. They then, of course, start declining as we get older. The second is other people, and we are taught to make use of this development, according to Rousseau, by other people. And then, of course, there is experience that we learn by what occurs. And this does seem to cover all the bases. There's then whatever we get, biologically, what we're taught by other people, and other things we learn that don't involve other people, directly. Given his view of nature, it's not surprising that he, is inclined to say that people should, when developing this education, watch nature very carefully and can see within this nature paths traced out for people to develop. He gives kind of a rough view of education because he does assert that nature gives children continual exercise and strengthens their constitution by ordeals. And kind of a brutal part, he says it teaches what pain and trouble mean. So kind of like the road to education is paved with pain and suffering. In some ways, he does seem to be right, because there's a lot of things in nature that can hurt us and kill us. And of course, there's always gravity in solid objects. So that, in a way, he's right. We do learn a lot of things by, experience and bad experience. And he takes this to be the law of nature. Now, given his view that corruption stems from artificial stuff in cities, not surprisingly, he believes that attempting to correct nature destroys nature's work and counteracts the effects of all her cares. So he believes that nature will be our guide. Now, there are approaches today that still adopt this view, the idea that people can learn from, being out in the outdoors, definitely true. And of course, the fact that nature can hurt you, or the natural world can hurt you, and teaches you things. That's definitely true. And there are programs like Outward Bound, which kind of explicitly aim at getting people into nature to learn things. That nature is cruel, but fair, but mostly cruel. So, looking at the education, but kind of by age zone. So the first age zone for Rousseau is 10, about 10 or 12. So at this stage, according to him, if the method being used is that of nature and Rousseau has made no mistakes, then he believes he would have conducted his pupil through the region of sensations. Basically, again, the view that essentially they're like animals, and they've reached what he calls the boundaries of childish reason, kind of the beginning of reason. And then they start, transitioning from essentially being wild animals to start actually being humans. And he claims that every age and station in life has a perfection, a maturity of its own. And when Emile speaks of what Emile has thought or done, he claims that he speaks of evil as freely as good, and not embarrassed by its effects on those who listen, or so he claims. And he claims that the student will use words in all the simplicity of their original meaning. Now, because this upbringing is natural, at least according to Rousseau, he claims all these wonderful benefits, that Emile does not know the meaning of custom or routine, I guess presumably because there has been no custom or routine, which does raise questions about, do people develop that kind of on their own without being taught, or do they have to be taught it, etc. He also asserts that Emile will never follow a rigid formula or yield to authority or example, which does of course lead to questions about how Rousseau serves as a guardian when the student does not yield to authority or example. And he says that all that Emile does and says is after the natural fashion of his age. And one can expect no formal speeches or studied manners from Emile, but the expression of his own ideas and conduct arising from his inclinations. Essentially, basically the natural path. Contrasting, of course, against the kind of city artificial view of presumably formal speeches and studied manners. So what about moral ideas? Because this section, after all, is about moral education. And he claims that Emile, through the guidance of Rousseau, has few moral ideas in relation to his own concerns. But what about people in general? Well, Rousseau says none at all. No moral ideas at all. Why? Well, he does raise a good point that as a child, and not yet being an active member of society, these would be of no use to him, supposedly. Although one could say that even children are parts of society and do need morality. So his view is that apparently you don't need, morality as a child. He does, however, according to Rousseau, understand liberty, property, and common consent. And this manifests as Emile knowing why his own things belong to him and those of another don't belong to him, but he claims that beyond this he knows nothing. So he has basic property. For those who have a dog, dogs often have a similar level of conception. They know which, if they're good dogs, they know which things are toys they can chew, and which things, for example, are your shoes, which they should not be chewing at a certain point. So at this point, Emile is essentially kind of like a dog level, roughly speaking. Except for the fact that, of course, he doesn't know the meaning of duty and obedience, doesn't understand commands. Now, in terms of, what Emile does, again, according to Rousseau, if you happen to run into Emile and if you're told that if you'll do him a favor, if you'll do one for him, if you'll do a favor for him, he'll do one for you, essentially, he's fine to go along with that. So he gets the idea of exchanging, favors. What, according to Rousseau, he likes to do best is increase his power and get you under obligations, so he claims. And it may be, he speculates, that he enjoys being recognized as somebody and accounted worth something. And if that's the case, according to Rousseau, if he's motivated by that, he has left the path of nature. But according to Rousseau, again, major assumptions, that Emile, knowing he is free in his own master, he will do nothing from mere thoughtlessness or just to show that he can do it. Again, just asserting these things. So then finally at 15, according to Rousseau, he is showing Emile a path to knowledge not difficult, but without limit, solely measured, endless and tedious to follow. He's showing Emile how to take the first steps so that he can know its beginning, but allow him to go no farther. Now at this point, according to Rousseau at least, since Emile is obligated to learn by his own efforts, he is on his own, so to speak, he employs his own reason, not that of another. Rousseau claims that most of our mistakes arise from others, which obviously can be debated, but one could make a case for that. And if Emile is not to be ruled by opinion, he must receive nothing upon authority, which could be seen as good advice in the sense that simply believing things because someone says they're true without actual evidence is generally, bad reasoning. Although one could, of course, make the case that if someone is an actual authority in the sense of knowing things, then it would be reasonable to believe them. And he believes that, again, he's really big on exercise and suffering, and he believes that this continual exercise would invigorate the mind as labor and fatigue strengthen the body. So basically, he believes that part of moral education is doing mental work, which seems reasonable. So what qualities does Emile have at this point? Well, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Emile has a range of these positive qualities, and returning to the notion of not receiving nothing on authority, as you might recall when we looked at our good dead friend Aristotle believed that the state should be the primary moral educator. Failing that, the parents would do the work. And Aristotle placed a great deal of emphasis upon, the ruler essentially imposing moral education, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau would clearly be opposed to that, explicitly opposed to that. So for Rousseau, at the kind of end of the education of Emile, he regards Emile as having the following qualities, or supposed to have the following qualities: industrious, temperate, patient, steadfast, and full of courage. So the classic virtues. Also, according to Rousseau, that Emile's imagination will not exaggerate dangers, and he claims that Emile will feel few discomforts and bears pain with fortitude because he has never learned to contend with fate. He does not yet know what death is, somehow, but accustomed to yield to the law of necessity, this gets kind of grim, he will die when he must, without groan or struggle. To live free and to have little to do with human affairs is the best way of learning how to die, at least according to Rousseau. And then Rousseau lays out more of these, what he sees as positive qualities, the result of his moral education. And so, in some ways, this is also kind of a virtue approach to education. So, according to Rousseau, Emile will have the social virtues. To have these, he only needs to know the relationships which makes them necessary, and his mind is ready to receive them. He considers himself independently of others, and is satisfied when others do not think of him at all. He exacts nothing from others, and never thinks of owing anything to them. He is alone in human society, and depends solely upon himself. He has the best right of all to be independent, for he is all that anyone can be at his age. He has no errors, but such as a human being must have. He has no vices, but those from which no one can be exempt. He has a sound constitution, active limbs, a fair and unprejudiced mind, a heart free without passions. Self-love, the first and most natural of all, has scarcely manifested itself at all in him. Whether disturbing anyone's peace of mind, he has led a happy, contented life, as free as nature will allow. So he ends up being, at least according to Rousseau, through this process, a virtuous person of a certain sort, Rousseau's conception. And as we've seen, this differs quite a bit from Aristotle's model, which is that the people are born basically morally neutral, and then they must have moral education effectively imposed on them from a young age, and for Aristotle, ideally by the state, and this persists through all of life. And so considerable distinctions between Aristotle's method of very authority-based moral education versus Jean-Jacques Rousseau's view, which is essentially kind of let nature is basically good, and essentially we just have to keep people from being corrupted through proper guardianship, and then they'll develop the proper virtues. And of course, for the most part, our current education system in the United States is clearly very focused on an Aristotle-style approach, very authoritarian, very focused, and generally not allowing people to just kind of engage in these natural virtues. So that concludes our look at moral education.